I want to start with something small, something almost too small to matter. A tuning fork. I was going through an estate sale, one of those strange Saturday afternoons where someone's entire life gets priced and tagged and laid out on folding tables, and I picked up this old tuning fork. Heavy. Brass, I think, though it had gone dark with age, and stamped on the handle, barely legible, was a number. Not the number I expected, not the number you'd find in any modern music store, in any contemporary orchestra hall, in any school music class today. The number was 432. I didn't think much of it at first. I'm a researcher by habit and a skeptic by training. I believe in evidence. I believe in documentation. I believe that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and I've spent enough time in the archives to know that most mysteries dissolve under the fluorescent light of proper sourcing. But I kept the tuning fork, and the deeper I looked, the harder it became to put it down. Because here is what I found. Slowly, over months and then years, there is a history of sound that we are not being taught. There is a lineage of frequency, of resonance, of architectural acoustics, of therapeutic vibration, an entire science of listening that appears to have been quietly, methodically, and with unsettling coordination removed from the record. Not lost, not forgotten through the natural erosion of time. Removed, this raises a simple but critical question. Not when did we stop understanding sound this way? Not why did healing music fall out of fashion? Not what caused the great cathedrals and opera houses and hospital bell towers to fall silent? No. How? How does an entire civilization forget how to hear? Let me give you the official explanation first, because it deserves to be heard before it's examined. The official story goes something like this. For most of human history, musical pitch was unstandardized. Different regions, different courts, different instrument makers all tuned to slightly different frequencies. In 1939, an international conference in London agreed to standardize concert pitch at A equals 440 Hertz. This was a practical, logistical decision, good for radio broadcast, good for manufacturing instruments at scale, good for international musical cooperation. Clean, rational, boring, and in isolation. That explanation holds. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like exactly the kind of bureaucratic housekeeping that modern institutions specialize in. But the official explanation collapses here. It doesn't account for what was before. What was the standard before the standard? This is where the record goes strange. Because when you go looking, and I mean really looking, not just at Wikipedia summaries, but in the actual surviving documentation, in the tuning records of instrument makers, in the acoustic analyses of old instrument collections in museum storage, in the scattered correspondence of 18th and 19th century composers, you begin to find something that doesn't fit the story of harmless standardization. You find A equals 432, not everywhere, not in every document, but with a frequency, if you'll forgive the word, that is difficult to dismiss. Italian opera composers, certain instrument makers in Northern Europe, specific references to philosophical pitch in theoretical texts. The number 432 appears and reappears like a watermark in paper you have to hold up to the light to see. Verdi. Giuseppe Verdi, one of the towering architects of operatic construction, a man who understood sound the way a cathedral builder understood stone, advocated explicitly for A equals 432 Hertz. He believed other tunings were harmful to the voice, harmful to the instrument of the human body itself. He wrote about it. He campaigned for it. This raises a simple but critical question. If one of the most celebrated sonic architects in Western history believed a specific frequency protected the human voice, what exactly did we lose when we abandoned it? And here's the strangest part. We don't really know, because almost no one is asking. I want to take you somewhere now. I want to take you inside a building, not a concert hall built last decade, with its engineered acoustic panels and computer model geometry. I want to take you inside something older, something that predates our current understanding of acoustics by centuries, and yet somehow, impossibly, it sometimes seems outperforms it. The great cathedrals of Europe are acoustically extraordinary. This is not conspiracy, this is not fringe theory. This is measurable, documented, studied by acoustic engineers who have spent careers trying to reverse engineer what medieval builders accomplished without software, without frequency analysis, without anything we would recognize as modern science. The reverberation in Chartres Cathedral has been measured at 8 seconds or longer in some registers. 8 seconds. In certain frequencies, a note sung or struck inside that space will continue to reflect and resonate long after the source has stopped. The builders chose those dimensions. They chose those materials. They chose those proportions. Why? The official answer is aesthetic. It sounds grand. It inspires awe. Fine. But the deeper I went into the architectural record, the more that explanation began to feel insufficient. Go to New Grange in Ireland, a passage tomb older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, and you find that the inner chamber has acoustic properties that researchers have struggled to explain within the context of simple burial architecture. The space resonates at frequencies consistent with the lower range of the male human voice. Some acoustic archaeologists have described standing waves inside the chamber, nodes of concentrated sound pressure, that would have created physical sensation in anyone standing in specific positions. Go to the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta, an underground complex carved from living rock thousands of years ago, and you find the same thing. Deliberate, precise. A chamber called the Oracle Room that produces resonance at approximately 110 Hz. Not approximately, not roughly. Researchers have measured it. 110 Hz sits at the lower boundary of what is considered the primary frequency range for the human male voice. And here is what 110 Hz does to the human brain. Multiple studies. I want to be careful here because I am not a neuroscientist and I am not making medical claims. Multiple studies have suggested that this frequency range may suppress the prefrontal cortex, the seat of ordinary analytical thought, and activate older, deeper brain structures. The structures associated with altered states, with pattern recognition, with what ancient cultures called the oracle's voice. Did the builders of the Hypogeum know this? They couldn't have. We're told they couldn't have. And yet the chamber exists. The resonance is measurable. The architecture is deliberate. The official explanation collapses here. Not partially, completely. I kept a list as I researched. A list of anomalies, details that didn't fit, patterns that accumulated. One pattern I couldn't escape: bells. Specifically, the relationship between bells, hospitals, and healing. We know that bells have occupied an almost universal position in human culture across enormous distances of time and geography. Church bells, temple bells, monastery bells. We know that in medieval Europe, during outbreaks of plague, bells were rung. The official explanation is ceremonial, marking death, calling for prayer. But there's another possibility, one that the historical record gestures at without quite stating. There are accounts scattered, marginalized, not in the main textbooks, of bell ringing being used not merely to mark illness but to respond to it. Hospital records from certain European institutions in the pre-modern period describe specific bell ringing protocols, not just any bells, specific bells, cast to specific proportions, rung at specific times in specific patterns. What were those proportions? What were those patterns? Where is that documentation now? Mostly it isn't. Mostly it has not survived or has not been prioritized for preservation, or exists somewhere in an archive that hasn't been digitized and may never be. But here and there, fragments surface. Accounts from travellers describing sanatoriums and healing houses, where large bells were housed not in towers above the buildings, but within them, in the walls, in dedicated resonance chambers. Accounts of patients being brought into proximity with ringing bells for purposes that the writers of those accounts describe in terms we no longer use. Terms like harmonic restoration, terms like frequency alignment. These are not scientific terms. I want to be clear about that. I am not endorsing them as scientific claims, but they are consistent with something. They are consistent with a body of knowledge that appears from multiple angles and through multiple independent sources to have once existed and to no longer exist in accessible form. And that's where the Tartaria question becomes impossible to ignore. If you've spent any time in the corners of alternative history research, and I want to be precise about that phrase, alternative history, not as a dismissal but as a description, you've encountered the question of Tartaria. The maps exist. This is not disputed. Major European cartographic traditions from the 15th through the 18th centuries show a vast territory in Central Asia labelled Tartaria or Tartary on maps produced by serious cartographers working within serious institutional frameworks. It is there. It is labelled. It is depicted as substantial. And then, gradually, it isn't. The deeper I went into what we do and don't know about this territory and its people, the more a particular question began to form. Not the question of whether Tartaria was an empire in the conventional sense, not whether its rulers wore crowns and signed treaties. Those debates I leave to others. My question is different. My question is about what Tartaria may have known, because here is what the evidence, fragmented, contested, incomplete, seems to suggest. There existed, in the pre-modern world, a tradition of sonic knowledge that was not European and not Asian in the ways we currently divide those categories. A tradition that understood the relationship between architecture, frequency, and the human body in ways that our current models of history insist were impossible for that era. And the architecture is still there. Buildings throughout Central and Northern Asia, throughout the territories that the old maps once called Tartary, that do not fit the official story of their construction. Buildings with acoustic properties that exceed what their attributed builders were supposed to have understood. Buildings with proportions that echo, again forgive the word, the proportions of the great European cathedrals without any documented transfer of knowledge between them. This raises a simple but critical question. Why do buildings built supposedly in isolation, in entirely different cultural traditions on entirely different continents, keep arriving at the same acoustic conclusions? Not similar, not approximately similar, the same. That is either the most extraordinary coincidence in architectural history, or it is evidence of something else. I want to stay with the opera for a moment, because I think the opera is where this becomes most visible and most poignant. The great opera houses of the 19th century are sonic instruments. This is not metaphor. The acousticians who have studied them, the engineers and researchers who have gone in with measurement equipment and emerged somewhat baffled, describe them in terms that almost sound like reverse engineering an artifact whose purpose has been partially forgotten. La Scala in Milan, the Vienna State Opera, the Palais Garnier in Paris, the Bolshoi. These buildings are built to carry the unamplified human voice to the furthest seat in the house. No microphones, no electronic assistance. The architecture itself was designed to move sound in ways that contemporary buildings, with all our computational modelling, frequently struggle to replicate. And the voice that those buildings were built to carry was trained specifically, deliberately, over years, to produce sound at frequencies and in harmonic patterns that used those buildings, that entered into relationship with the stone and wood and plaster and produced something that neither the singer nor the architecture could achieve alone. There are accounts, old accounts from regular audience members, not musicians, not critics, not people with any theoretical framework to impose, just people who sat in those rooms and listened. And the accounts describe physical effects, warmth in the chest, a sensation of pressure shifting, tears that arrived before the emotional content of the music seemed to justify them. Were they simply moved by beautiful music? Perhaps, almost certainly, in part. But the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. And the pattern includes something that is very difficult to explain as mere aesthetic response. Physical sensation. Measurable, locatable physical sensation at specific moments in specific pieces. What frequencies were those pieces written in? What tuning systems were those singers trained in? What relationship did those frequencies have to the resonant properties of the buildings that housed them? We don't know. We don't know because the detailed documentation of those tuning systems, the specific technical, practical knowledge that a voice teacher in 1840 would have passed to a student about how to produce and place specific frequencies in a specific space, that knowledge did not survive the standardization of the 20th century in the form that would allow us to reconstruct it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The loss is not accidental. The loss has a shape. This is where the skeptic in me pushes back hardest. And this is where I want to be honest about what I can and cannot claim. I cannot claim that anyone planned this. I cannot identify a meeting room or a document or a named institution that decided in some specific year to remove healing frequencies from human culture. The evidence does not support that claim, and I will not make it. But here is what the evidence does suggest, and I think it's more interesting and more troubling than a simple conspiracy. A convergence. A period, roughly the late 19th into the early 20th century, in which multiple, apparently independent decisions were made, in multiple fields, in multiple countries, all moving in the same direction. Standardization of pitch, away from 432 toward 440. Standardization of medical practice, away from what the old records call environmental therapeutics, the use of sound, resonance, architecture, toward pharmaceutical and surgical intervention. Standardization of urban architecture, away from the proportional systems and acoustic priorities of the older building traditions, toward glass, steel and concrete, materials that do not sing. Not one decision, not one institution, not one country. Many decisions, many institutions, many countries, apparently independently, all moving in the same direction at the same time. This raises a simple but critical question. What does it mean when a convergence looks exactly like a coordination, but you can't find the coordinator? The silence was deafening. In the archives, in the transitional documentation, the records of why these changes were made, the technical justifications, the rebuttals to critics who raised concerns at the time, the silence is deafening. what should be a rich record of intellectual debate about the abandonment of centuries of sonic knowledge is, in many cases, simply nothing. The evidence suggests something much larger than administrative tidying. There is a thing that happens when a large bell rings in a stone room. The bell produces not one frequency, but many. A fundamental note and a cascade of overtones, partial frequencies that follow mathematical relationships determined by the geometry of the bell. Bell makers in the older traditions understood this. They tuned their bells not to a single pitch, but to a chord, a carefully proportioned harmonic series designed to produce specific interactions between the fundamental tone and its overtones. Those interactions produce beats, rhythmic pulses of amplitude that emerge when two close frequencies interfere with each other, and those beats occur at specific rates that are, I want to be very careful here, that are measurable in ranges corresponding to biological rhythms, heart rate, breathing rate, brainwave frequencies. Is that coincidence? Was it known? Was it studied? Was it, in some tradition we no longer have access to, deliberately cultivated, the old hospital bell towers? I keep coming back to them. Bells mounted inside healing institutions, not above them, inside them, where the patients were. Why? The official history gives a ceremony and schedule, bells marking the hours, calling for prayer, announcing meals. Practical, administrative, religious functions, fine. But why inside? Why in the walls? Why in some accounts fragmented, marginal, difficult to source, but impossible to entirely dismiss, described in terms of therapeutic protocols? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The architecture of healing and the architecture of sound were, for most of human history as best we can reconstruct it, the same architecture. They shared a foundation. They spoke a common language. And somewhere in the long disruption of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the wars, the industrialization, the great standardizations, that language stopped being spoken, or stopped being spoken aloud. I don't know what Tartaria was. I want to be honest about that. I've spent long enough in this research to have opinions, to have hunches, to have moments at 2 a.m. staring at a map dated 1689 where something clicks into place and feels, not proves, like recognition. But I am not going to tell you I have answers. The evidence does not give me answers. The evidence gives me shapes, patterns, the silhouettes of things that were once there and are now absent. What I believe, carefully, provisionally, with all the appropriate uncertainty, is this. There was a knowledge tradition, a sonic knowledge tradition, one that understood the relationship between frequency, architecture, and the human body in ways we have lost access to. Whether we call that tradition Tartarian, or something else, or nothing at all, is secondary to the question of whether it existed. And the buildings say it existed. The acoustic chambers say it existed. The tuning forks, the bell protocols, the opera houses that engineers still struggle to explain, the healing spaces designed around resonance before resonance was a scientific concept, they all say it existed. The deeper I went, the more the official timeline, the story of human progress moving in one direction, forward, always forward, accumulating knowledge, never losing it, began to feel like a story told to someone standing in a room with their back to half the furniture. What were those frequencies? What did they do? What did the builders of Newgrange and Hal Saflieni and the old hospital bell towers understand about the relationship between sound and the body that we are only now, with our instruments and our imaging equipment, beginning to approach from the outside? Why does the architecture of healing keep pointing in the same direction across cultures that were not supposed to be in contact? Why does the music that old theorists call philosophical cluster around frequencies that contemporary researchers tentatively, controversially, incompletely associate with measurable biological response? Why do the accounts of sonic therapy, from traditions separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, keep describing similar experiences in similar spaces? And why, at the specific historical moment when we might have developed the scientific tools to study these questions seriously, to measure, to document, to understand, did the practices themselves largely disappear? Not fade, not evolve, not transform into something recognizable. Disappear. The silence was deafening. The official explanation collapses here. And the pattern, the unsettling, accumulated, cross-cultural, architectural, acoustic, medical pattern, repeats with a precision that feels at this point like a message. I still have the tuning fork. I keep it on my desk. I don't use it. I'm not sure I'd know how. But sometimes, late at night, when the building settles and the street goes quiet, I pick it up. I hold it. I think about the hands that made it, about the rooms it was designed for, about the voices it was meant to tune, and I listen, not to the fork, to the silence around it, to the shape of what isn't there anymore. Once you see it, once you really hear it, you can't unhear it. The frequency is gone. But somewhere, in the stone, in the proportions, in the mathematics of the bells, the rooms remember.